Calliope's Tale, Chapter 13, Red Sky and Morning, by FalcomReynolds. They had the advantage at dawn. Alizarin and his ships would have to look and fire into the rising sun. So they set sail just before, as the sky was paling to the gray of Petrel's breast. With Denzel and the ships he chose to accompany him, nestled in the center point formation. Calliope swam below the midnight sun, which sailed off the course of the north's starboard side. The harpoon gun was strapped to her back. Alizarin's fleet was waiting. Calliope, below the water, counted the hulls she saw and frowned. There were far fewer than there had been before, and the strangeness was almost gone. Perhaps Alizarin had lost his hold on the ships, and they had just been an intimidation tactic. She doubted this, somehow. But where did the ships go? She couldn't surface, not now, but she drifted up a bit, closer to the midnight sun. Something about this whole situation felt off. The collective fleet advanced. Denzel was fleet point, and he stepped up and stared at Alizarin's ships, waiting. After a few minutes of slow progress, he raised one hand, and the ships stopped, backpedaled, pulled their sails, reversed winds they had been using to propel themselves. He cleared his throat. Beside him, a young woman laid one hand on his shoulder and nodded. The faint smell of honeysuckle drifted on the wind as she concentrated. "Alizarin!" Denzel said clearly, and his voice echoed across the swell, amplified by magic. "Stand down and face justice at the hands of the sisters of Baroni Hakir and the goddesses of the sea." Calliope had to know, to see. She surfaced in front of the midnight sun, between it and the curse of the north, and looked at the enemy fleet. A moment passed, and then a figure in a crimson coat stepped up on the foredeck of the ship in front of the fleet. And, yes, that had to be the heretic, with its deep reddish hull, and the dirty canvas sails streaked with rain and the name painted in black letters over the planks. Even from this distance, Calliope could see Alizarin aboard his ship. The heretic wasn't supposed to be out in front, though. Denzel had said she would be hiding behind other ships, and though he'd never encountered Alizarin before, those who had were his informants. So why wasn't she? Why was Alizarin so bold? What was he hiding? Where were the dead ships? Alizarin's voice came hissing across the waves, curling around Calliope's ears. She glanced up to see Denzel shake his head. He was doing the same to him, and presumably to everyone on this side of the standoff. "As it happens," Alizarin purred, "I don't answer to the sisters or to the goddesses." Silence between the fleets. Calliope shivered. It was one thing to be casual about the goddesses, to not give them worship, but perhaps tip your hat at a shrine as you passed by, but to offer no other tribute. But it was a completely different matter to be openly defiant of them, to spit in their faces. "It is unfortunate that you believe that," Denzel called back, and to his credit, he sounded genuinely disappointed. "But what you believe is unimportant." Calliope scanned the horizon again, heart fluttering with uncertainty. Where were Alizarin's ships? "Our task is to recover you and bring you back to Baroni Hakir to be tried for crimes against life itself," Denzel continued. "Stand down and allow us to detain you." "That isn't going to happen," Alizarin spat back. "You are outnumbered and outgunned. If you resist and we are forced to kill you, we will." "We?" Alizarin laughed, a burbling noise that Calliope could barely comprehend. It didn't even sound human. "What we are you talking about? Your allies? I don't fear you. Your tenuous alliance is fragile as a bird's wing." A sharp crack echoed across the swell, far louder than it should have been. Calliope flinched. Alizarin had something up in his hand, grinning with bright white teeth. She narrowed her eyes to see it better. It was a small gray corpse, some type of seabird. A petrel. Calliope's heart lurched. Alizarin had snapped the bird's wing in half, though it was definitely already dead. It didn't struggle.
"Oh, I don't think you'll last, the three of you,"
Alizarin continued, flinging the corpse off the side of the ship into the waves. Calliope felt anger bubble up in her throat and forced it down, kept the furious song locked away.
"Look at you, Denzel Helice. So cold, so calculating. Can you feel? Have you convinced your crew you can? You can't rule without knowing anger, or fear, or triumph. You're weak."
Calliope glanced up. Denzel was staring back, more perplexed than anything.
"And you, Kiara. May I call you Kiara? I'm going to assume the answer is yes. You're not a real ship's captain, and can't have the title of one after all. You're a slave to the crown. You hate it, but at the same time you revile those who claim their own freedom. A hypocrite, someone who hides their own desires out of fear. You have no will. You always wait for orders. If you had freedom, would you even know what to do with it?"
He snorted.
"Your hold is already failing out here, with no one to tell you what to do. Pathetic."
Silence again. Calliope couldn't see Kiara from where she was, but from what she knew of the Crown Captain, she was undoubtedly fuming silently.
"Sun Yang, what a lost, hopeless person you are,"
Alizarin drawled.
"You never belonged. You never will. You can't even belong on the ship you own. You're lying to yourself, believing that you have a home out here. The sea doesn't like uncertainty."
Who are you to know what the sea wants? Calliope thought, furious. Sun Yang was a friend now. She abhorred these insults. Are you finished yet? Denzel called after a moment. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for a response. A sigh.
No,
Alizarin said.
I have a request. Give me Ianthe.
Stunned and very confused silence, Calliope saw Denzel glance over towards the midnight sun, as startled as she had ever seen him, before turning back to Alizarin.
No, he said after a moment. I don't think we'll be doing that. She's my first mate,
Alizarin countered.
She belongs on my ship.
Not anymore, Ianthe shouted out over the waters. Calliope looked up when she heard her voice. She was leaning over the rail, gripping the edge so hard it drove the color from her fingers, directing her voice over the waves. It certainly didn't carry like Denzel's did, but she had no doubt that Alizarin could hear it.
So she speaks,
Alizarin murmured, that smile creeping into his voice again. He extended one hand, the motion clear, marked in bright red against the blue sky.
Thank you for joining the conversation. I have an offer for you, Ianthe. Come back to the heretic, and I will show you power beyond imagining.
Your power is a lie, an insult, Ianthe yelled back, expression contorted in rage. You are a monster, and I will have no part of your vile, blasphemous rituals. Alizarin shook his head and made a horrific, sticky, clicking noise, which at one point may have sounded like the tisk-tisk of a human tongue.
What a shame,
he said.
But come over anyway. You still belong on my ship, and your soul would give me so much use.
How about, Makullo shouted at the top of his lungs, inserting himself into the exchange. You shut the hell up! A startled pause, and then laughter.
You're not part of this,
Alizarin called back, and Calliope knew he was smiling. though she had never seen his face closely enough to envision the expression.
Do keep your tongue to yourself while your betters are having a conversation.
This is your last chance, Denzel called, taking control of the negotiations once again. We will not give any of our number to you, and if you yet again reject our offer of mercy, we will kill you.
Try it,
Alizarin snarled, and then stepped back off the heretic's bowsprit. That ended that. The young woman took her hand from Denzel's shoulder as he turned back to his crew. It was worth a try, he said, voice back to normal, and smiled ruefully. She could see the worry on his face, though. He'd noticed the lack of ships the Calliope had reported. He glanced down to the waters. Where are they? He said, quietly, to no one. I don't know, Calliope hissed, shaping the words so they would reach only his ears. I don't know. They were here. They were there. They were there. They were there. And now they're not. Be cautious moving forward, Denzel said, turning to his crew and fleet. Be very cautious. There may yet be dangers we do not understand. The collective fleet began to move forwards again. The heretic, facing them, drifted backwards, hiding behind 4 ordinary pirate ships. Calliope surveyed the enemies. None of their dead ships were there. So where were they? She stayed low, in the sun's shadow. As they neared Alizarin's fleet, she felt the temperature of the water suddenly drop, a deep cold that bit past her thick skin and fat layers and into her bones. She got out of the way in a hurry. Denzel stood at the fore of the Curse of North, arms extended, hands held out to his sides, but low, almost casual. The air was suddenly permeated with the sharp scent of mint and the pungent odor of lemongrass. His eyes were closed. The swell around the ship began to turn from ordinary water into slush and ice crystals, with larger chunks bobbing up and down like miniature icebergs. And then it began to solidify into one sheet that traveled with the Curse of North into an aura of cold. It surrounded several other ships, but where their hulls touched the water, the ice melted, and behind them it reformed. Calliope had to dip down and look up to understand what was happening. Because the other ships could not break through the ice, Denzel was creating small, moving patches of clear water for them. She marveled at the control it must take for the 5 ships that surrounded him. There was a boom of thunder, and Calliope glanced off to the left and saw Kiera's unit racing towards Alizarin's fleet, flanking hard port and arcing around to broadside his ships. Sun Yang's unit peeled off to the right and surged through the waves, arcing around again. And still the heretic did not move. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Alizarin's ships were reacting to the attack, yes, but not as they should. They acted fearless, almost greater than they were. Could Alizarin have hidden his ships from sight, like Calliope could do on occasion? No. It would have taken far too much effort, and Calliope would have seen them from below anyway, as disturbances in the water. So what was his secret weapon? What was the... Movement caught her eye, somewhere behind her. She whipped around and searched the gray-blue depths, trying to see between the rays of light slanting down into the half-lit murk. There. Movement again. Fish, perhaps? No. It wasn't fish. A thin spire of wood speared up from the darkness. It rose, growing thicker, and there, the rotted remains of a crow's nest. Calliope lashed her tail furiously and powered directly upwards. No time to worry about being seen, no time to worry about the other ships on her side. She burst through the surface with a gasp and bellowed, "Below! They're coming from below! They're under the water!" Her voice carried. She saw pirates around her look around in shock, though not many of them spotted her. "Brace yourselves!" she yelled, and the first mast broke through the surface. Vast, dark shapes emerged from the depths, sailing upwards through the water and rising like serpents. It was far worse than serpents. That horrible, unnatural strangeness radiated from them and made Calliope want to tear her own skin to get rid of it, like a slick coating of oil. And she could see what once were people still on board, ready to fight. This was Alizarin's triumphant secret. He had not lost his ships. They were simply lying in wait to ambush the collective fleet. Ships that did not need to breathe could lurk below the surface. A wreck rose not far to her right, and she watched in horror as it came up underneath a live ship and knocked her so hard to the side that she pitched too far and capsized, sending her wailing crew into the water. Calliope looked down into the water immediately and was relieved to see that nothing was directly below the midnight sun. She paused, then dove again, and was grateful she had, as a second later the booming of cannons echoed overhead as the sun fired into the dead ship. It didn't seem to hinder it much, but it was moving up, away from her. Calliope swam for it and grabbed onto one portion of the hulls where the planks had been partially torn away and made for good handholds. She stared up at it. Kiera was right. If these were destroyed entirely, it didn't matter how much magic Alizarin pumped into them, they wouldn't float. She pushed down the fear at the back of her mind that told her maybe even that wouldn't be enough. It had to be enough. It had to be enough. Destroy them. But how? Calliope yanked hard on the planks under her claws and watched more debris flood out of the already waterlogged hold. Water alone wouldn't do it. Narrowing her eyes again, Calliope opened her mouth and sang a sharp, high-pitched note. The water around her shivered, and the iron bolts holding these planks onto the skeleton of the ship went white-hot and created bursts of steam that hissed up towards the surface. With a little bit of pressure, the old wooden board came away in Calliope's hand. She grinned and tore at them. Once there was a large hole she could get her hands onto. The ship listed to one side as she ripped its hull to shreds, tossing the chunks away. Most of them floated, but some sank towards the blackness below and vanished out of sight. She saw one of the people, who weren't any more, fall out of the hole and hit it with her tail, sending it flailing into the deeps. She didn't get to finish her work. She felt the water around her pulled urgently and recognized Ianthe's touch, trying to get her attention. She turned. A dead ship was headed right towards the midnight sun at ramming speed, aiming to catch her right in the side. From what Calliope had seen so far, the wrecks didn't stop. They were disposable, and damage couldn't take them out of the fight like it could on a live ship. Calliope abandoned the ship she'd been tearing apart and shot towards the new threat. If she tried to push it... No. She would likely slip off the hull, and she'd been trying to lift it out of the water. That wouldn't work. Calliope scraped her claws over the wood, skimming underneath it. She couldn't push it away. Perhaps there was something else she could pull on. To turn it aside? A trailing piece of rigging, maybe. A dark line caught her attention, drifting off from the bow of the ship just near her. She backbent and caught it. It was an anchor chain, disconnected from whatever had once hung from its end. This might work. Calliope wrapped the chain around her torso with a quick twirl, keeping it away from the harpoon gun, and started to swim. It was almost immediate. She felt the entire weight of the ship pull hard, pressing into her shoulder and pinching, ripping at her skin. She strained against it, pulling as hard as she could, and to her fierce relief she saw the ship above wrenched off course, cutting hard to starboard. No reason to stop. Calliope renewed her efforts, swimming with her whole body, away from the midnight sun and down, away from her family, towards the deeps. She only knew she was getting somewhere by the dimming light and the lessening sounds of battle, though the booming of cannons and the screams of breaking wood still assaulted her down here, and she heard it from everywhere, from every part of the battle, near or far. Sound carried in the water. The ship she was dragging was trying to get back up, and she could feel the spirits swarming around her. But they didn't know what she was, didn't know what to make of her, and she forced them away with a hissed note and a couple of bubbles that scared them off. When she had gotten down far enough, she turned and sang the same note as before, but louder this time, and she turned with a flick of her tail and swam the length of the entire ship, singing the whole way down. If she did this near the surface, it would rebound onto the ship she wanted to keep together. Down here, the sound still carried, but the power didn't. The chain in her hand melted instantly. The bolts in the wood, the grating on the deck, the lead framing of the windows, the locks on the doors, Everything came apart as she sustained the note, and she watched the ship disintegrate before her eyes. Once she was certain it was drifting apart and not reforming, she returned to the surface for a breath of air, filling her burning lungs. Magic made her body hurt. Calliope cleared the water from her eyes with a shake of her head and glanced around. Things were not going well. She saw the curse of the North had managed to get near the heretic, but wasn't yet in a good position to fire on her, despite her front-facing guns. The midnight sun was fine. She hadn't been hurt yet, and Calliope took a few gulps of air and watched one of the crew members spot her and wave, relief etched on their features. She grinned back. The curse of the North was no longer between Calliope and Kiera's unit. She glanced over to see how they were faring in the battle. Not well. They'd been ambushed, but the angle of their attack put them in a perfect position to be rammed by the dead ships, and Calliope could see the wreckage of one galleon slowly sinking beneath the waves. She swallowed nervously and looked to the Queen's Bounty. She spotted it just in time to see the prow and bowsprit of a dead ship crash through the Bounty's side, sending wood flying and splitting the ship in two. She gasped despite herself. She could see figures flung from the deck into the roiling water. Denzel whirled at the sound of the crash, eyes wide. "Calliope!" he shouted. She understood. There was no time to get them with lifeboats. She dove underneath the water and streaked towards them, wondering how many people she could carry. Denzel turned again, searching the water, and caught sight of her as she shot by. She flicked her tail above the water to signal she'd heard him. He could focus on the fight. The dead ship lost most of its momentum hitting the Queen's Bounty, but still had enough force to crunch through the rest of it and press the rest of the ship down into the water. It was one fancy gilded caravel against a three-masted sailing galleon. There was no contest here, and the Queen's Bounty hadn't been ready to avoid the hit. As soon as the dead ship passed by, Calliope swept in, searching the wreckage for survivors, specifically for Kiera. There. The captain was floating, barely conscious in the water, thankfully face up. Calliope reached out and scooped her up in one arm, slinging her over one shoulder. "Who?" Kiera managed. "Shush," Calliope said, moving through the floating debris. There were a few other bodies, but only 2 of them were alive. Easy enough. She gathered the 3 of them. She could easily hold 3 humans, and held them out of the water while trying to stay low to the surface herself. A ship cut between her and the midnight sun. It was a live ship, but not a friendly one. On its low deck, she saw pirates rushing back and forth, eyeing her. "What the hell is that?" one of them shouted. Whoops. She couldn't dive because she was carrying 3 people. But she couldn't exactly peacefully move around them and expect them not to fire on her. She didn't think. Instead, she beat her tail and propelled herself upwards, transferring the humans to one arm, and hauled herself up onto the ship. The pirates were not prepared for this, and neither was the ship. The entire thing listed to the starboard as she pulled herself up, grinning, and set her passengers down gently on the deck. "That ain't no whale," one of the pirates managed dumbly, before Calliope whipped out the harpoon gun and fired. It went smoothly through his lower torso and then retracted, reloading itself. Mikulow's latest alteration to it. The pirates on board rushed her like idiots. Perhaps they were compelled to do it. She didn't know, but she dispatched them easily enough, either with the gun or by throwing them into the water or hitting them as hard as she could with her hands and claws. Once none were left on the deck, she slipped the harpoon gun back on her back, grabbed the survivors, and rolled up the ship back into the water. It seemed that nothing else noticed her as she slipped between pieces of ships to get back to the midnight sun. She watched Denzel drop the sheet of ice around his ship and instead bring it up in front of the Curse of the North, cutting her off from the heretic. This was a retreat, then. The great engines in the Curse's belly roared, and the water churned around her. Calliope wanted to fight, but Denzel was now the captain of these fleets, and she wasn't going to leave her family so she could fuss about some dead boats. She brought the sailors to the midnight sun and shouted. They lowered a lifeboat while turning the ship, and she dropped the humans in. Ianthe was leaning over the rail, looking worriedly down. "Calliope," she called. "Go! It isn't safe!" "I'm fine," Calliope called. "I'm going to look for survivors." The mast of a ship rose near her, and she, as a reaction, slammed her weight into the side of the midnight sun and pushed the entire ship to the side, through the water. The dead ship rose easily up, dripping and black and readied century-old cannons. There were dead ships everywhere. Calliope could fight, but she couldn't fight that many, and they were being surrounded. She looked back up. Ianthe was gripping the rail with her eyes shut. She was going to do something. Calliope caught the scent of Ianthe's magic, pepper, oil, and rosemary. Ianthe? Zikal, Ianthe began. Goddess of life and death, of the in-between, the salt in the water and the gleam of light on the waves. Ianthe, no! Zikal was far, far more dangerous than any other goddess of the sea. Calliope surged upwards, clawing at the wood of the hull, trying to draw her attention. She was going to get herself killed. She was going to die. Ianthe! Ianthe was not listening. As I stare into death and welcome it, I want to reflect my demise to it. It does not belong here. It has already died. I want to send it back. It has no right to overstep its boundaries. Once our time is up, we do not get any more. Ianthe! I call upon you, Zikalitha Ravani, to grant me the power to restore balance to the world. There was no response but silence. Silence that grew, blotting out sound, muting out the crash of ships in the swell and the thunder of the summoned. Muting out the crash of the ships in the swell and the thunder of summoned clouds and cannon fire, erasing the shouting of the crew. Alizarin's hold on these ships is less than yours should be, Great One. Help me send them back to... There was no bolt of lightning, no spires of stone or coral, no massive waves, just a faint sensation in the world of something changing, and a fleeting moment where sound was muted, and a ripple, ever so faint, flashed out from Ianthe and depressed the ocean in a circular pattern, flicking over the tops of the swells and past the ships. Aboard the Midnight Sun, Ianthe collapsed. But around the fleet, the dead ships shuddered and went still. The figures on their decks collapsed, slumping into sodden heaps of old rags and bones. The sound of cannon fire continued for a few seconds, then ceased. Ianthe! Calliope yelled, but there was no response. Back! Denzel called, voice amplified again. Calliope looked to the curse of the north and saw that she had turned fully and was powering as quickly as she could away from the heretic, her engines screaming. What remained of the collective fleet was turning, heading east, relying on the sunrise to help cover their retreat. It was working, and it seemed that Alizarin was unwilling to follow them without his dead ships. What have you done? He hissed through the air in waves, voice following them, tainted with fury. It smelled like honey and an alcohol Calliope wasn't familiar with. She shook her head and tried to clear the scent from her nose and mouth. No one answered. The ships fled. The wind weakened. Go! Alizarin hissed, voice distant but still audible through the breezes. His voice licked against Calliope's ears. She shuddered. Leave the dead. They are mine now. The fleet retreated.